Here we go. Right? The webinar has started. Yes, it started. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I hope everyone's doing okay. I'm going to start a poll while we're waiting, while we get some more people joining us today. And we're always curious, always would love to know what prompted you to join us for today's session. Is it educational? Are you doing project research? You know, we're talking about moving away from spreadsheets. This is a hot topic. We get this all the time. So maybe this is why, because you have a project to move away from those. You don't know why you're here. You know, you'll learn something. You'll probably be confused, but maybe it'll help you. And maybe you're a prevalent customer. And if you are, welcome back. And hopefully we'll be able to help you even more so than before. So I'll leave this up for a hot second here. All righty. Well, today we have two excellent men here that is a part of our prevalent team. We have Alastair Parr, ISO 27001 Lead Auditor and Implementer, and our very own SVP of Global Products and Services. And plus we have a small feature with our content manager, Thomas Humphreys. And they both will be, trying to help you guys get free from the tyranny of spreadsheets, because no one wants to deal with those. And a couple of housekeeping stuff. You guys, we are all muted here. Just want to give you a heads up. You can't talk, but please utilize the Q&A. You can utilize the chat, but if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, because sometimes it will get lost in that chat, especially if it's booming with some good conversation here, and we will answer all of those as much as we possibly can. As far as the poll questions, there's one that's happening still right now, and there's one at the end. Please answer honestly, because we do follow up based on your answers, and you'll probably hear from myself or a couple of my counterparts. So don't be surprised if you're wondering why we're reaching out to you. It's because of what you say in these poll questions, ultimately. So that's pretty much it. Oh, Amanda gave me an email saying, okay, yep, I will, sure, no problem. And then as far as the recordings and the slides, you will get the recording tomorrow. If you do want the slides, please let me know. I can put my email in the chat. I think that's pretty much it for me. Again, I'm Amanda. I'm also the host of this webinar session, but all the brain and power is going to be coming from these two guys. So I'm going to hand it over to Alastair, and you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So obviously you've got Alastair here today, and I've invited my esteemed colleague, Thomas, with me on the basis that Thomas has the blessed role historically of being exposed to assessments in the form of auditing as much as he's been driving content and creation of content. So we're extremely lucky, at least I'm certainly lucky today, to be able to have Thomas to be able to support and give me some insights into what he's seen and what he's experienced across the board when it comes to assessments, assessment fatigue, and that general journey on a whole. So, welcome, Thomas. Hello.
Hello, no, thank you for the very kind introduction, Alastair. Yes, hello, everyone. For those of you who may not have been on any of webinars that I've done in the past, my name is Thomas Humphreys, and I help to build content within Prevalent, ranging from all the key sort of frameworks and regulations. And as Alastair indicated, prior to my role at Prevalent, I used to be an auditor, predominantly in ISO standards, working in certification bodies in Singapore and the UK, and working on assessments globally as well. So, no, pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Thomas. So as you can probably tell, there's a few topics we're going to cover off today, as much as we're going to give you some tips and insights into taking those first tentative steps towards moving off spreadsheets and moving into a more sort of cohesive process for managing third parties and the assessment journey. What we will cover off prior to that is, well, really, what should an assessment achieve? So if we take a step back and really understand why on earth are we actually sending each other assessments in the first place and filling up our days, as much as we like to do a good job and keep ourselves busy, there must be a bit more to it than that. We'll then touch on what actually makes a good assessment. And I'm very intrigued to hear what Thomas has to say as well, from his wealth of experience of building assessments that have been used by tens of thousands of vendors when they're completing assessments. And we'll discuss the criteria that normally falls into that camp. We'll then move on to well, why do we even bother transitioning off a spreadsheet? Surely a spreadsheet is good enough. I think that could be a relatively straightforward question for us to answer today, but we'll certainly touch on that. And then we'll move on to some of the most common challenges that we see, not just from assessments and assessment migration, but also about the content, the engagement journey, everything that you tend to experience when you are dealing with somebody, as in a human being. And then, of course, we'll move on to the first tentative steps. So, moving forwards, and just hopefully you can all see the slides change now, but why? So, what we have identified, and this actually comes from a prevalent survey that we did in 2021 called TPRM at a Crossroads. But what we identified was that 45% of the participants still use spreadsheets in assessment workflows. Now, that was particularly surprising to us on the basis that spreadsheets themselves have some inherent challenges, and again, we'll touch on those shortly. 40% ignore areas such as anti-bribe and corruption. So this was an interesting topic for us from the perspective of how broad assessments were in the sense of their coverage, how comprehensive they were. Were they touching on criteria beyond just control-based assessments, which was some of the early drivers and focus areas for assessments. We identified that 2/3 of responders saw procurement, exec, and legal becoming more and more involved in the assessment workflows. Now, this was reassuring because we appreciate that there's multiple vested parties in the assessment journey. It is not just a control-based assessment. And just to qualify, we will share these slides afterwards as part of the recordings later on. So by all means, if you see any value in these, you can certainly take them with you. 45% report experiencing a third-party data breach or incident within the last 12 months. Now, this was enticingly shocking to us because if 45% of those responders are seeing third-party data breaches occurring within the last 12 months, that suggests an issue, and that suggests that control-based assessments aren't necessarily giving us the level of visibility, or we're not reacting to them suitably. So spreadsheets as a mechanism clearly have some challenges, particularly 45% of us are still using them. 32% are reporting that it takes longer than 30 days to meet third-party risk audit requirements. And that means reaching out to a vendor, giving them the spreadsheet, giving them the assessment, whatever it may be. And bear in mind, this is a blend. These are people who have spreadsheets and have automated workflows. So if 32% of them are taking more than 30 days, that's a relatively long period of time to get some form of engagement from someone who's just about to sign a contract with you or has just recently done so and is trying to make themselves look good. And greater than 50% track contractual risks throughout the life cycle. Sorry, do not track contractual risks throughout the life cycle. So greater than 50%, just qualify that, are not actively managing risks downstream as they progress. Now, if you want any more information about any of these metrics or findings or how we can specifically address any of these requirements, please feel free to reach out to us. And we do have some literature on our website, on our blog at prevalent.net, which talks in a bit more detail about those. And you can certainly get a bit of a package related to those. But as you can see in front of you there, there's a pretty broad section of challenges and issues, as well as evolving scenarios that will impact how we manage assessment workflows. So, with that behind us, what should an assessment achieve? And by the way, we will go and spend some time answering some questions. We'll try and weave them into the general discussion here as best we can. But equally, we do have that Q&A session at the end. So if we don't manage to weave it in organically into our conversation today, we will absolutely cover it off in the Q&A section as well. But what is ultimately an assessment trying to achieve? Why do we have an assessment in the first place? So the very nature of an assessment, as we're seeing for risk management specifically, is there to provide insight into controls and deficiencies. That was the primary sort of organic use case people use it for, which is what are the issues that we're facing when it comes to dealing with this third party. And the value of it, if you're using a spreadsheet or otherwise, is that it's baselining data inputs from multiple vendors, third parties, whether you're using proprietary assessment questions or your own, or one from a public source. You know, we appreciate that you're trying to baseline it so you can accurately and consistently engage the vendor, understand the issues, and do it at scale. If you're going to do it free form every single time, then that's even worse than just simply using a spreadsheet. The assessments themselves are trying to provide an auditable record of a point-in-time situation. So I send out an assessment to poor Thomas. Thomas is spending the next 6 hours of his day filling it out very kindly, sends it back, and from the minute he's sent it to me, it is out of date. But it's very useful, and it certainly provides some insight, which I otherwise would not have been able to obtain. Traditionally, the point of a spreadsheet-based assessment is to glean information that you might not necessarily get from open sources. So if you're passively scanning the organization, if you're doing business monitoring, if you're looking at financial records, there's of course information, demographics data that you can extrapolate, but usually you're using a control-based assessment via a spreadsheet to capture more information and, more importantly, qualify it by getting it direct from the horse's mouth. You want the vendor to state it so that you have that auditable record in case something happens and goes wrong. So, what have we seen people sending via assessments and via those spreadsheets? And typically it's 5 core areas that we've been seeing more commonly. There's information security, of course, which ties into the threat piece on the right-hand side. So that's the control-based data, understanding vulnerabilities and weaknesses in relation to their security posture. Business continuity and resilience, particularly in the last few years, has taken a more prominent seat in this whole journey. Regulatory obligations, and we're going to hear a lot more from Thomas shortly on some of the regulations and compliance mandates that help drive these assessments. And of course, suitability as well. So that can relate to ethics, ESG, financial stability, quality management, suitability controls, etc. So there is a whole host of data that is being captured in the form of assessments and can be mapped back to any control-based information that we're interested in. So Thomas is a resident expert of ours of a whole myriad of various controls, compliance frameworks, regulations, and has more acronyms that you can shake a stick at. So Thomas, I wonder if you could give us a bit of insight into how assessments support compliance and regulatory mandates.
Absolutely, thank you, Alastair. And hopefully everyone can see the page. And what we've got on the page is, you mentioned acronyms, it represents perhaps just a small volume of the complexities of regulations, standards, best practice frameworks. You take a look at information security and IT security, for example, the likes of the NISTs, the ISOs of the world, SIGs, SOX, cloud standards. From a procurement perspective, some new and emerging and hot topics, particularly around ESG, it's certainly gaining more and more traction. And this represents perhaps one of the first challenges for any organization is, where do we begin? If we want to look at assessing third parties, vendors against information security, data privacy, some of the legal requirements and expectations that are being enforced onto us by regulatory bodies, key interested parties, our own customer base, where do we begin? And this is what can make the whole journey so daunting and so complex. So having a look and understanding what frameworks, what best practices are really key to us, and where do we want to focus on, is really the first step in being able to identify where do we want to go and how do we approach third parties and engage in the right areas, the right avenues, and I say the right type of assessments. One thing that we'll come on to later on in the assessment in discussion is how you can blend many of them together and where you can see a lot of synergies. So to take ISO and NIST, for example, the way that both of them use governance and technical capabilities can help organizations to frame a wider assessment around information and cybersecurity. So there's a lot of thought process that needs to go into here, but this represents a large, complex piece that really needs to be explored by any organization to make sure that you're looking at the right type of assessments, the right type of standards when you begin that TPRM journey.
Thank you, Thomas. And for those of you who would like to hear more of Thomas's words of wisdom as well, there are some recent webinars we've done on the likes of NIST, and we'll have some content on the new ISO framework shortly as well. So please feel free to check those out. But we will dive into a bit more detail on how we can blend some of these criteria and these various regulations and frameworks into a good assessment, and how we can make ultimately that journey better by not necessarily using a spreadsheet to do so. Thank you. So now I did say I'd try and weave in some of the questions as we move along. So just to highlight as well, there was some questions about those who are using spreadsheets and whether we're actually seeing improvements in quantity over quality. And the sad reality is, if I'd sort of hop back and just touch on some of that data points for a moment there, is that invariably people who are using spreadsheets are not necessarily getting the responses back from the third parties in the same timeframes. We've actually done a fair few tests on our side, and a spreadsheet takes longer to get back as opposed to a platform-based tool or a standardized assessment format. So from a quality standpoint, it's either taking longer, or you might not even necessarily get a formalized response back. And the quality is usually very heavily impacted by the fact that the fields that tend to get populated are quite often unstructured. You can input your own variables, the fact that people tend to use partial, full matches, etc. And all this feeds into our next topic, which is what makes a good assessment. And then we'll touch on some of the downfalls and pitfalls that you have when you start using spreadsheets for this. So one of the first components that helps drive a good assessment ultimately is suitable consideration of the third-party lifecycle. And what I mean by that is, very often we see assessments coming through, and this applies to when we get assessments ourselves, where they are structured in a way where they're clearly for a targeted audience. We will get an assessment from the InfoSec team. We will get an assessment from procurement, which might cover financial stability, the payment terms, etc. And we might get separate questions from the privacy team, for example. Now, it's relatively disjointed, and I appreciate they all have their own lens and their own interpretation. But from our perspective, one of the things that helps make a good assessment is suitably considering that entire journey. So is there a way that we can consistently capture the information that these different representatives of the business need in one fell swoop, rather than spending the time piecemeal reaching out to the third party, having their attention, then losing it for 2 weeks, getting it back again? I appreciate when you have the advantage pre-contract, they're more likely to engage, but post-contract, that becomes a little tricky. So when we start considering the life cycle, we can start factoring in and considering how can we have a more structured assessment that's not on a spreadsheet necessarily. At this point, we haven't said why, but not on a spreadsheet necessarily, that's able to give you the information you need across the spectrum of that third party's life cycle. So what else do we tend to consider? So we've talked about the spectrum in the sense of that entire journey for the third party, but there's additional information that we tend to segment that out into. So there's the assessment itself, but there's also additional periphery data in the form of cyber monitoring or cyber insights even through the assessments, business intel, financial positions, financial statements, ownership hierarchies, operating locations, historical events, and equally so events in the future. We have to give them the opportunity to be able to escalate those to you continually rather than just point in time. Monitoring and tracking things like their certifications, which if you're using a spreadsheet, the reality is you're going to have a cell populated somewhere with the expiry date of a document, and then it'll be buried away somewhere. And also their fourth or nth parties. So these wonderful things all amalgamate into creating a comprehensive profile. And if you've got all the relevant data that creates that, that's when you can start really capturing and considering context. So the context of who that vendor is and what they do, you have a much better lens, particularly if that's unified in a single place, into understanding what the challenges are, what they do, and how they can potentially support the business better. Now that context also extends to internal business context. So a good assessment is considering internal systems. So capturing context and sending out assessments that's going to help us understand where that third party sits in relation to the business workflow. They become an intrinsic link to your organization. They're helping generate revenue, or they're delivering a service of some value. So naturally they are part of that chain. So what we strongly recommend through a good assessment is making sure that you're capturing information from the business and also slotting in that third party into that internal workflow and journey. So you want to be asking questions that help you understand from the business owner or whoever the relationship owner is, what is the third party? What are they doing? Why are we engaging with them? What's the value here? So already we're starting to see that a spreadsheet-based workflow begins to fragment because we have these comprehensive profile aspects that we want to consider, which we're not necessarily considering. And then we also have the fragmentation of understanding from the business who they are and what they do. So it's already starting to present a bit of a challenge when we're starting to do this on a spreadsheet, unless you are the most organized, capable person in the world, and I certainly am not. So when we also start looking back at that good assessment criteria, there's a series of things that we consider as fundamental in the definition of that assessment piece. And I'll ask Thomas on the next slide to talk a bit more about how we can structure that, but just talking about the journey here, the things that we tend to see considered from a higher level for a good assessment includes things such as understanding from a maturity aspect. Do we actually need to make the most fantastic, wonderful spreadsheet assessment in the world right now? Or does the business happily accommodate something that's more straightforward, that's going to get data back from the third party quicker? So from a maturity definition standpoint, you can start assessing your current maturity, where you need to get to, and then factor that into the types of criteria that you ask. We then suggest defining the key metrics. So if we're actually looking at these assessments that we're building and distributing, what does it need to include? So from a key metric standpoint, it should be able to be completed within 4 hours, for example. It shouldn't involve more than X number of participants in order to get the information in. So understanding some of the demographics really of that assessment and how it be completed. Quite often people will just populate everything they're ever interested in under the sun in a big flat list in their spreadsheet. And the reality is you're going to get mixed quality data and it's going to take longer. So we do recommend suggest considering what that assessment looks like and targeting the audience, targeting the assessment to the audience. Part of that is being driven by the scoping. So what are we actually trying to achieve from the assessments? What types of what aspects of that comprehensive profile do we need to consider when we're building it? So do we need to start reviewing against compliance, regulation, risk, privacy, anti-bribe and corruption, modern slavery, etc.? Some of these domains might be relevant or may not be relevant for you. And then start considering segmenting that based on the service lines and the sub-services. So what is the third party doing? And is there any way that we can create some degree of formula that says these criteria are going to this third party subset, these criteria and domains are going to this other? So you can start being a bit more calculated about who receives what rather than a one size fits all. Because let's be honest, Thomas doesn't want to spend the next 8 hours completing an assessment for me. Now, if you do that correctly, you can start standardizing and benchmarking against the third parties. A spreadsheet makes that difficult because you have unstructured data sat there. But if you are using any form of mechanism to be able to track and compare the vendors, that's when you can start looking at that benchmarking and standardization. And that includes things such as the remediation planning at the top there. So building a journey. So rather than just getting the data and then having an individual sit there and interpret it, you can start planning and coordinating what that's going to look like, that broader journey. We'll touch on that in a bit more on the next slide. And then finally, and this ties back to that key metrics criteria, is the human factor. So those of you on the line may know or may not know, but Tuesday morning is the best time to send out an assessment. You're most likely to get a participant to start completing it. We have the value of seeing metrics of people logging in, interacting with assessments based on distribution times and so on, but human factors are interesting. If you give somebody more than 2 weeks to complete an assessment, they'll generally put it off and wait till later. If you send it on a Tuesday morning, you have a higher, as I mentioned, you have a higher rate of opening and actually interacting with it. If you send out an infographic style data sheet that articulates what you're doing and why you're doing it, and have some form of executive buy-in and sponsor referenced in that material, again, that increases the chances of success. So there's lots of different criteria that you flesh around an assessment beyond just here's a spreadsheet that will help reinforce your program. It will drive it forward. You'll get better data quicker. And ultimately, you can then start focusing on the issues rather than just collecting data. So with that in mind, content. So there's a few things that you can see on the right here about what good content looks like. So broadly speaking, Thomas, you've had very broad experience in dealing with building content, both from structures, parent-child relationships, mandatory evidence and documentation, including help text, remediation, defining key domains. Is there any guidance or support or advice you'd have for those on the line on how to address it?
Yes, absolutely. And so certainly those areas that you can see on the right-hand side, just starting off this journey of saying, if we use a scenario that we've identified the type of standard, the type of regulation or framework that we need to work with, and we need to engage our third parties on, let's use ISO 27001 as an example, we can then begin to work out through some of the profiling, through some of those key aspects of understanding our third parties, how we can shape that content, how we can shape that assessment. So thinking about the question format and structure, particularly if we're dealing with lots of different types of third parties, some maybe in a so-called tier 1 or high priority, some in the so-called tier 2, 3 or 4 or lower priority. And we want to make sure that the way we ask the questions and the way those questions are formed and structured not only best represents the results, the end results that we need to get out of the assessment, but also helps the responder along. Because ultimately we need to make sure that whatever assessment we're going out, whether it's a multiple assessments across multiple standards or a singular survey, that obviously we get the best results. So how do we do that? So in terms of the question format and structure, we need to start thinking about what type of questions. Now, there'll be some cases, particularly from a regulatory standpoint, where yes/no style questions are more practical. There's a black and white answer that either you have something or you don't. You may have a data privacy policy or you haven't developed a data privacy policy, for example, thinking about the GDPR, CCPA, California Privacy Act style of regulation and requirements. In some cases, there may be a need for a more open-ended question. If we're looking at particular policies, so let's take the ISO 27000 as an example, there may be more of a need to explore the way an access control policy has been formulated or type of encryption and encryption capabilities an organization has. And so it may be more relevant and you may get more value out of understanding not just did they have an encryption policy or did they have an access control policy, but what are the key aspects that make up that policy? What are the key considerations the organization has implemented to enable them to build an effective suite of encryption tools or systems to help manage their data security in a better format? Help text is very interesting here because, again, I mentioned that when you're sending out assessments to responders, obviously you want them to be able to fill out the survey, the assessment as accurately as possible. And obviously one way to do that is through the use of help text and almost guidance. The purpose here is not to tell them what question to answer or how to answer it in terms of select this one, but to give them a wider view of the purpose of the question. Now, this is particularly relevant when you're looking at very small organizations versus very large, complex organizations, where you're asking a subject around, for example, the use of firewalls or intrusion detection systems for information security, or the use of how they're managing carbon footprinting when you're looking at ESG and capturing and managing their carbon. It may be relevant to provide that level of guidance to make sure it's clear the purpose of the question and the context to which they should be answering related to the product and service they're supplying to you. And obviously, once we start to formulate these assessments based on clearly defined question and question types, help text and guidance, we can then look at the remediation as well and domains. So let's go back to the ISO standard as the example. For anyone who knows, ISO splits its assessment into two aspects: the high-level structure that looks at the context of the business, how it manages risk and the management format, and then what it calls Annex A, which is the 113 different controls and control points. And it may be relevant not just to bundle everything together into one very large survey, but to break them across into separate security control groups or domains. So you're asking operational security controls to a particular responder in an organization. Then you have business continuity or personnel security-based controls or compliance-based controls that because they become modularized or separated into separate domains, make it easier for the responder to then engage in the right personnel, their end, to make sure that they get the best answers and responses back to you. And then finally, through the checkbox and question format structure, it's also important, and this is where the third-party profiling can come into it very effectively here, is to make sure you're not asking the wrong questions for the vendors. So to give you an example, if you're aware that some organizations don't produce systems or software in terms of development for you, there's obviously no point asking them questions around system and software development. If they don't manage or hold or have access to personal information, there may be privacy related questions that are just not relevant for that type of business. So making sure you format the questions in a way that you're asking the right questions to the right responders or to the right third parties, and still getting that level of assurance back that the type of results, the type of risks or issues that are coming out, or the positive sides, the controls that have been implemented, are appropriate to the type of business that you're engaging.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Thomas. Insightful.
Okay.
So, with that in mind, so we understand some of the criteria that we'd expect to see in a good assessment. Now, you might be thinking, surely some chunks of this feed into a spreadsheet anyway, and surely that's going to fit the bill. So why on earth are we going to bother transitioning off something that we've been using for decades and has served a purpose? And let's be honest, we all know that spreadsheets are very capable. And those of you who are well versed in how to create weird and wonderful assessments via spreadsheets, you're probably quite happy to some extent, but there are some innate challenges with doing that. And when we start doing human-driven spreadsheet analysis, some of the more common things that we tend to see that start creeping out of the woodwork here is that, as Thomas mentioned, there can be a degree of inconsistent interpretations when you're dealing with remediation. If you have free-form cells where someone's able to input whatever they like, or even a simple yes/no, the reviewer could be interpreting it badly, whoever's populating it, but equally so the person reviewing the results might be interpreting it differently. So you end up with an inconsistent interpretation, both for remediation and also the very nature of the assessment questions. We very often see that there's a vendor reluctance to complete a spreadsheet. It will sit dormant, relaxing in their inbox for a degree of time, and will get buried away in a folder marked U, and eventually they might get around to it after a series of chases. Now that lends itself to the challenge of unstructured storage. So you have an assessment in the form of a spreadsheet, which quite often contains control-based data, which would be lovely to see if you wanted to find a way to infiltrate that organization in some shape or form, sitting on someone's, well, in someone's mailbox somewhere, potentially sent unencrypted from point to point, and is just rife and ready to be misused, lost, etc. So that unstructured storage is not a great situation, and also means you don't necessarily have a secure transfer mechanism. Quite often when we receive assessments in a spreadsheet, it's email based, and we grit our teeth and it frustrates us, but nonetheless we try and encourage and push at the very least a secure transfer mechanism rather than just plain email. And there is that soft process for collection. And what we mean by this is that if I send Thomas an email that he studiously buries away in his inbox, I need to remind Thomas every now and then to go and complete it for me. Weeks pass, etc., and eventually I might get a response back, but nonetheless, there's that consistent driver and expectation that either myself or Thomas needs to remind one or other that this is to be done by someone at some point. So it's very manual in that respect. And then that leads into collaboration. Quite often the collaboration exercise that we tend to see is one of two things. I send that spreadsheet back with my red lines. So I say, Thomas, here are the 113 controls that you've responded to and questions related to that. I have 6 additional questions. Can you add another column explaining what you're doing about it? Opens up more interpretation challenges, more vendor reluctance, more soft process for collection, and the process continues. And we eventually end and gravitate down towards that spiral of never getting the data back. And then, of course, we've got the manual remediation aspects. So manual remediation for us here is really about the fact that I need to then go and interact with Thomas in order to get information back, in order to do something with it. So spreadsheets are inherently challenging in that respect. And they also tend to serve a point in time. So when we start using spreadsheets as a mechanism, we appreciate that can be a point in time, one and done approach, and people feel that they can't deal with the sheer volume of what's being pushed their way. It could be a nuisance, very much a nuisance in that respect. Equally so, content could evolve and change over time, and I'm not necessarily going to get the insight and understanding that from a spreadsheet to understand, does this meet the compliance mandates, the new ISO framework, the new version 27002 that comes out in a couple of years' time? It's not necessarily going to be targeted and also retrospective. And the final component on why spreadsheets can be a problem is that we appreciate that that's just a single piece of that comprehensive profile, perception. So when we start looking at some of the other periphery things that we're doing in order to assess these third parties, we're looking at things like monitoring data. We're looking at IT-sec issues, we're doing passive scanning, we're doing dark web investigations, we're looking at contextual business information. Have they had any violations, legal filings? Are they financially secure? Have they had any insolvencies, any payment deficiencies? Are they on any global sanctions lists? Are they going bankrupt? Are they going for M&A? All these additional questions that most people aren't necessarily asking in those assessment spreadsheets. They're using periphery data in order to support and identify that proactively. It's where the entire third-party space has evolved to try and add a degree of continuous monitoring rather than just rely on those point-in-time assessments. Now, we did have a question at the start, which I saved intentionally for this slide, where somebody inquired as to whether we know the percentage of those experiencing breaches at the start also use spreadsheets, or do they use other tools? Now, an interesting thing that we've pinpointed when we started to look at our percentage of vendors that have had organizations that have had a data breach or incident through their vendors in the last 12 months being quite high, something we began to learn when we dug into that is that part of the reason why the percentage was so high was because all of a sudden they now have monitoring capabilities that give them insights into deficiencies that they didn't before. Historically, you'd send the control-based assessment out and you wouldn't really know that the vendors had a challenge or issue. Nowadays, with the advent of things like monitoring insights, you can now start seeing, hey, they've now been added to a sanctions list, they've had a data breach, we've seen material about them on the dark web, etc. All of a sudden, you're escalating the quantity of findings, events, data breaches, etc. That doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't there before. It just means that now all of a sudden we're more aware of them, something you don't necessarily get purely from a spreadsheet. So with that in mind and understanding those some of the things that we can address by either expanding our reach beyond a spreadsheet and a single assessment, we can all start considering how do we actually deal with some of these challenges that we're seeing. So a few more data points that we're seeing right now, and this is from a 2020 survey that Prevalent had issued out. So we realized that 52% of those we engaged with did not have a standard way to present risk data. So one of the more common challenges here is how do we consistently interpret risk from all these assessments that we're doing, whether on a spreadsheet or otherwise. And part of the challenge and the resolution here is by having a centralized risk register where you're consistently mapping answers to risks and responses to likelihood of those risks occurring. That way you can be more meticulous in your interpretations over time. Now, Thomas, I appreciate that you've had a fair bit of experience doing auditing from this respect. So how have you found the challenge of not being able to consistently interpret and grade and map risks in your experience?
Sure. Well, one of perhaps the most fundamental, I'd say, issues, saying from a spreadsheet perspective, and sort of aligning that to creating a holistic risk register, is just being able to sort through the volume and potentially vast volumes of issues and responses, but it's also that understanding at the end. And if you think with a centralized risk register, the ability to consolidate risks and issues, to investigate trends, particularly across multiple organizations, is made so much simpler. And so by having disparate registers capturing all sorts of risks across a potentially very large vendor base is incredibly clunky, and it can actually cause more headache, particularly when you're looking at the reporting side and having to report back up to exec, senior management, and other key stakeholders.
Fantastic, thank you. So from that perspective, if we're addressing the challenge of content in this standpoint, it's about mapping responses back to risks and findings, and linking the responses, rather than just using the binary yes, no's, as Thomas alluded to earlier on, linking more contextual based answers to likelihood values that we could then extrapolate overall risk scores for. And we'll touch on that a bit more when we talk about some of the quick wins you can apply. But the second core challenge group that we're seeing from our analysis is that, so 62% lacked a standardization process for reviewing assessments, whether they're spreadsheets or otherwise. 52% additionally had the failed to examine resource requirements. So we understand that we are following this process. How on earth then do we make sure that we've planned for that by using the right team structures and so on? And 59% were overspending on resources. This is, they were using a savvy, experienced person such as Thomas to sit there chasing assessments and getting data from assessments back, rather than using that time more valuably on looking at risk remediation and guidance. So if you look at this as a group here, having suitable roles and responsibilities and the right capacity planning and structure around it is very, very important. And the advantage is if you have a structured workflow for assessment distribution and assessment collation, whether you're on a spreadsheet or otherwise, is very important. So you can get the people like Thomas focused on the right criteria, being fixing risk, interpreting risk variables and nuances, as opposed to chasing and harassing people to get responses back. Is there anything you'd like to add to that at all, Thomas?
Actually, there's a term there, I think, and I think it hits the nail on the head perfectly when we're looking at this. It's time to market. When you're looking at a standardized process, having that buy-in across the business to make sure that each respective business owner, staff from information technology, from legal, from senior management, from operations, from across the board. If you have a consistent process of not only understanding your risk, but the way assessments are run, how it's delivered to each respective business unit or business owner's vendor and vendor base, but also that consistency in how we address them, and making sure that the business risk appetite is represented is critical. And again, it just represents that disparate view that you can come from, in some cases, very clunky and overburdensome spreadsheets, and the process where business units and business owners are not speaking to each other. So it just represents that importance of getting to a place where we can standardize the way of working and the way of managing third parties.
Thank you, Thomas. And then if we look at the final core challenge group that we're seeing is remediation. So expanding on what Thomas has just said then. So we saw that 86% had inconsistent remediation guidelines on how to actually effectively deal with the data that comes back via the spreadsheet or via the assessment. And 59% had incomplete risk scoring mechanisms. And what we mean by this is ties to that initial criteria there of the content, but they hadn't established a way to consistently interpret how the risk score will change over time through things like the remediation steps that they apply downstream. So I know from my auditing days, it was particularly challenging where another auditor had been on site and had reviewed an assessment and hadn't actually interpreted things the same way I had. They had their own domain knowledge. They might have been particularly good at, say, data loss prevention and focused heavily on that, whereas another might be focused on physical security and so on. That lack of interpretation and focus and consistency in that focus is very, very problematic. So a heavy percentage of the people we've been engaging with have challenges in making that consistent remediation guidance and interpretation guidance clear to their audit teams. And Thomas, I don't know if that applies to anything or anything you want to add to that either.
Yes, absolutely. And again, for me, this comes back to background noise. Apologies. This represents this concept of knowing what risks to address, what risks to remediate at the right time, and it can be so difficult to know where to begin without that structure around what do we remediate and at what time, particularly when you're presented with potentially a large volume of risks and knowing which ones are critical priorities for us in the business at this point in time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Thomas. So the last point we'll touch on before we talk about some constructive steps, tentative first steps that you can apply to help transition off those spreadsheets, is the questionnaire fatigue aspect. So it doesn't matter whether we're using spreadsheets or whether we're using a technology to do so. We appreciate that there is a degree of questionnaire fatigue associated to that. And there's a few things that we can do that help streamline and address that. So that's participating in networks or exchanges where vendors answer once and share to multiple criteria, automate the analysis of documents as well as they come back. So if they give you a SOC 2 report instead, have the mechanisms in place to automatically interpret that. Same for things like ISO 27001 Annex A, as Thomas kindly touched on earlier on, or standardize your assessments to common frameworks, whether that's the Prevalent Compliance Framework, whether that is Shared Assessments, SIG, or something else that might be specific to your vertical. Having that standardization will make it easier for you to start getting those responses back from the vendor. Now, you can certainly segment that, use all the criteria we discussed earlier on, but if you use standard terminology, it may make life more straightforward. So when we start looking at our first tentative steps towards migrating off that, we appreciate there's a fair few challenges that we're looking to address, and the reason why we're moving off those spreadsheets. We don't want to use disparate multiple tools. We don't want it to be stagnant, sat somewhere. We don't want to use binary responses. We want to be able to capture evidence consistently, interpret things consistently, and we also want to make sure that it's not overwhelming for those having to deal with the unstructured data. So where should we begin in making sure that we have a transition that's suitable to take us from this spreadsheet into something that is a better all-round tool? So that could be a product itself, or that could be using things like monitoring feeds, etc. But what are the things that we actually need to consider? So point number one, we'd say up front, is to actually consider context. Focus on that context. We want to understand, if we're looking through our vendors, what are they doing? Why are they doing it? Why are we even engaging with them? Not just from a spend standpoint, but what's our risk appetite in relation to the services they provide? Where are they providing those services from? And are there any particular compliance or regulatory obligations based on that service for processing activities and so on? So capture as much context as you can for your question sets or from the business. And that lends itself to the broader business itself. So the vested parties within the organization. So we strongly recommend spending time through that scoping journey to understand what procurement, what legal, what the risk teams, what operational teams, what audit all need from that assessment component. So starting that workshop, asking them what they're currently sending via spreadsheets, mapping it against what you're currently sending, and work on the basis that you want to ask the question once to that vendor rather than multiple times in different ways throughout that journey. And then you can start applying that context prior into making the whole journey a bit more palatable for the vendor and more interpretive for you. And when we start to look at that, when we're transitioning off that, we really should again consider, as we highlighted before, that end-to-end life cycle, that journey. So from the very start, when we're sending out assessments from sourcing and RFP, through to that contract management criteria, through to intake onboarding, prioritization, and then risk assessments downstream, control-based assessments, there's lots of different stages there where we are asking questions. Now, we appreciate that there might be situations where you can't break that out. If you're going through that very early stage RFI, RFP, you're limited in the number of control-based questions you can likely ask. However, if you look at your assessment, you should be able to stagger it. You should be able to say, right, this subset, I'm going to ask at this point of the journey, this for this audience, and so on. You follow that process down and you eventually have an assessment that's broken out, dealing with the right criteria, and ideally collated in a relatively short window, just so you can make sure you get information back from the vendor in a timely way. And when we start considering that, that's when we can start looking at that comprehensive profile. Assessment data, cyber, business, financial, etc. Review all the criteria that you could group it together as best you can, and then you can start removing any overlap against that. So you end up with a more succinct assessment group that you can use via, not a spreadsheet, but ideally for a technology or something similar. And that's where technologies tend to come into play more frequently, is when you actually start looking at things like the nth party mapping, the third parties of the third parties, their nth parties, and so on. These are organizations that you're most likely not going to send a direct assessments against, but you would want to include in your broader monitoring capabilities, or at least get the third-party insights into. So when you start looking at that transition from a spreadsheet to a more uniform structured assessment workflow and life cycle, think about those nth parties, understand who they are, what they're doing, capture whatever business information the third party has on those businesses, and then embed them into your monitoring workflows as well. Look for things like concentration risk. And then the fifth criteria there is KRI and KPI based insights and data points. So ideally you'd be using that group of assessment data rather than having it siloed. You can aggregate it together and you've justified your investment immediately, because you're able to start looking at trends, deficiencies, anomalies, both from a KPI standpoint, the performance of your entire program, as well as the KRIs. So you can see common risks and deficiencies based on the assessment data as it comes back. You can see trends on completion times, SLAs against the organizations and teams, and then start looking at anomalies as well. So let's say this vendor changed answers, games the system in question 4. You're not going to see that from a spreadsheet, but you'll be able to get that from that consolidated reporting piece. So think about some of the KRIs and KPIs that you want to extrapolate from your broader journey. So finally, before we move into that Q&A session and component of the session, Thomas, I wonder if you could give us a bit of insight into how we can best map frameworks, not just historical frameworks, but upcoming regulations as they emerge into that assessment journey without having to reassess and engage with the vendors multiple times.
Yes, absolutely. And so at the beginning of the discussion today, I mentioned that looking across the range of standards and frameworks, I mentioned ISO and this there's a lot of synergy and close ties with a lot of these best practices and requirements. And as we're seeing more and more organizations now are requiring not just a single siloed assessment, but a range of requirements from privacy to information security, to environmental, and some of the areas such as anti-bribery and ESG as well. By establishing a common framework, you can start to map in each of those individual requirements and assessments into either one wider framework and assessment through the use of categorization, through the use of being able to map from a control level, but also from a functional level or domain level, based on the type of surveys or type of standards and best practices that you're after. And obviously, one of the biggest pieces here is sort of twofold. On the one side, it means from the reporting perspective and reporting back up to senior management and interested parties, you can report on focusing on those best practices and requirements that are important for the organization. But then likewise, when these standards are updated, they're revised, such as 27002, or there are other frameworks that are coming in that could be applicable for your existing assessment, for example, data privacy. So we've seen from GDPR to the expansion of the likes of CCPA, and there are more and more North American state level privacy expectations and requirements coming on. By having that structure in place now, it helps you to do that continual improvement, continual monitoring, so that if there are wider expectations and requirements from a privacy piece, it makes it easier to start to build them into your existing profile, not least when you're trying to assess vendors on a year-on-year basis. And it makes it easier to then enable that mapping based on what they said in the past versus what new requirements are coming into the fold.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. Now, just before we answer some of the questions that we've got coming in, and by all means, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A. I believe we have another quick poll, Amanda.
We do. Thanks so much. Yeah, so the last question that we're curious about is if you are looking to augment or establish a third-party risk management program, there's 6 more months left in this year. We know this is another prime time for you guys to kind of start initiations for some sort of program in place for third-party risk management. And I'm sure what we all discussed was super helpful, and we can personally help with that too. I think there's one other question. I don't know if you see it. You do. You're on top of it, right, Alastair? It looks like.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of this is great help, but how do we apply this when assessing a one-person shop business partner?
Very good question. And it's something we actually hear quite a lot, which is we're building these weird and wonderful structures for assessment workflows and trying to make it scalable for us as distributors so that we can better handle and manage risk. But what is the criteria that we tend to see most when we start profiling a one-person shop is that they're not going to have 30, 40 policies on hand, funnily enough, because they're trying to do business. And they might have very limited knowledge on InfoSec unless the one-person shop is dealing with InfoSec or privacy, or whatever it may be. So there's going to be a limited amount of knowledge that they may have to the space. And we've seen some interesting approaches to that. So we actually used to manage a network of vehicle repair centers. So we're over 1,000 vehicle repair centers, and there tend to be quite often one-person shops or small sites that have very limited knowledge on it. And the thing that we found most useful here was building collateral and building a pack that helped guide them. So the assessment became less, tell us about all your risks and challenges, and became more about, here's all the things you should be considering when you're dealing with third-party risk, privacy, ESG, and so on. And actually what we ended up doing was sending out through assessments, supporting collateral. So rather than, do you have an InfoSec policy, yes or no, it became, do you have an InfoSec policy? Do you know what an InfoSec policy is? If they select no, then they automatically start to receive content. They receive baseline templates, guidance on what an InfoSec policy should contain, what it looks like, cut down version that's geared towards someone who's a one-person band in that respect. So it becomes less qualifying, like you would do with a larger organization, and validating, and becomes more geared towards education. It's in their interest and your interest to help bring them along to a better place. And that's something we haven't spoken about too heavily, but certainly having that help text, having collateral to be able to support them as well, is a great step in fleshing out that assessment journey that you're not necessarily going to get from a spreadsheet. So very good question there. Thank you.
Yeah, super helpful. Well, looks like that's all we have. Everyone's saying thank you. So thank you guys both for your time. We're at 3 minutes before the hour, and we'll give you all 3 minutes back in your day. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully it was insightful, and hopefully we'll see you all at the next one. Bye, fellas.
Thank you all.
Thank you.